So a really critical thing with this is the threaded rod goes through here and fits into this slot, and it goes through this T-nut in here, and it goes through a ball bearing in this hole. And if these two don't line up perfectly when they come together, that's going to prone to jamming up. So I'm going to just check the alignment. I'm going to put the bearing in here, and just to avoid the bulk, I'm just going to use a 3/8 inch bolt to put in here to check where things line up. And now let's put this against here, and let's screw that into here, and I'm going to stick a wedge in here to make sure this is pushed up against here, and that looks like it's going to line up very nicely. So I want to mount that thing exactly where it is, so we're going to clamp it in place just by putting a C-clamp on there. So that will be the exact position I want that mount to be. If at this point you find that things don't line up perfectly, you'll just have to make that piece of plywood again. That's why it's a separate piece of plywood. Well, next thing I need to make is this idler thing, which has a bearing on it and hooks over this edge on here and keeps this pulled back on here. I neglected to print the page with the dimensions on it, so I just used my 1-to-1 drawing and patterned it straight off of that. So that fits onto here, and I need to mount that bearing on here. So here's my bearing, and I'm using a relatively large screw to mount this, because this screw isn't going to pull through, and that countersink head of the bearing on the screw head will keep that bearing straight and centered. And another washer in here just to prevent the edge of the bearing from pressing against the wood. So I'm just going to screw that in. So that will fit on here just right, and it looks like it'll sit fairly level. If I put the bearing in the wrong place, then it would sit like this, or maybe like this, and that would look odd. It's going to get held down by a pair of wooden leaf springs that are going to stick into the box here. So before I mount this on here, I'm going to have to cut the slot in here for those springs. Now cutting this slot is going to be a bit of a tricky operation because I need to plunge cut into there with a table saw. So I'm going to basically mount that above the blade like so. And the blade needs to drop 4 centimeters into here, so it's at 4 centimeters now. And let's count how many turns that takes to lower. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I know now if I crank it up by 10 turns, that's going to come up to the right height. And the lateral position is pretty important too. So let's get it to about here. That's where the slot needs to be. And to fix where this is going to be, I'm just going to use my feather board as a backstop. So that prevents this from sliding. And the next thing I do is I'm going to set the fence. So the fence needs to be 3.1 centimeters from the blade. So that's about right. That's for the first cut. And now let's drop the blade. So there's our slot. Now I need to actually double the width on that, so I'm going to move the fence by 2 millimeters and then make that same cut again. So this time I clamped my box to the fence. I should have done that last time too. So here's the slot I just cut. It's a bit on the long side. Last time I used a 7 1/4 inch blade to cut that slot, and with that kind of blade you can get to the same depth without making quite as long a slot. So using a smaller blade on the saw would be more elegant for making this slot. So let's get the position for that hinge on here. It looks about good in the middle of the slot. I'm just going to mark that with a pencil. Now out of the jig we have a bit more room on here to work. So let's mark the holes. And now I can just use some thin pieces of wood to act like a leaf spring, and I put another piece of wood underneath. And depending on how much I put on there, I can adjust how much tension this puts on here, and that holds the carriage firmly against here. So here I'm cutting out the gears using paper templates on the bandsaw. I actually tilted the table a little bit in either direction while I was cutting the sides of the teeth to give them a little bit of a bevel. I have a whole video on making gears on the bandsaw, so if you want more details, just watch that. So the way the whole gear cluster goes together is first this gear and a T-nut go on here, and that actually gets pressed in the gear first, but right now I'm just putting it on loosely. Then a spacer, then the next gear, then two nuts, and those nuts act as spacers, and then the ball bearing, and then another nut. So with all this pressed together, this bearing provides the reference and the gears get turned by the other gears. From past experience, I found that the bearing on here centers much better if I put just a little bit of electrical tape onto the treads, and that makes for a very tight fit. Now an important test is if you hold it like that and spin it, that it all turns around nicely and that you don't feel the bearing wiggle. Right now the way this is on there, I can feel the bearing wiggle. You can't really see it on the camera. So now with the piece of wood stuck on that bearing, if I now twirl it again, you can see how that piece of wood wiggles back and forth. So I have to take that bearing off and reposition it so that that doesn't happen, because if it does, it'll just work itself loose eventually. That's much better now. I had previously put two nuts in here as spacers, but I forgot about fitting it in here. The space here is really quite tight. So right now with one nut in between, there's barely enough to get it in without taking the whole jig apart. Now the other thing is the gears end up hitting on here a little bit. This space is also very tight. I didn't want to cut too much away from here, so I'm going to have to chisel a little bit into here just to make room for the teeth of the big gear. So next I need to make this gear mount. It goes on here, slides back and forth, and the gears go in here, and then it locks on here with the knob in that slot I cut earlier. So I've just cut a block of the right length, and it's the right height. I haven't got the right width yet. I'll cut that later. So that fits on here, and I need to mark the line that goes along here. That's where I'm going to cut it open. That's also the line where this bolt goes in, and there's going to be two bolt holes, and the lateral positions for these is going to be here and here. They don't have to be millimeter accurate, so this is close enough. So the holes I drilled are a little bit too large for this bolt. The idea is that this bolt goes in easily, but once I cut that slot out and I clamp those pieces together, that'll grab it nice and tight. So the next thing I need to do is cut this slot here, which allows this block to mount, and that goes halfway in between these two. So let's just transfer that mark. So right about here. The problem is this is a view from that side, but I want to drill it from this side. And let's see, that goes about this far from the top, so about here, and this far down. So those scratches are kind of hard to see, so I'm just going to pencil those in. So I've just drilled 3 overlapping holes in here. I'll chisel out in a slot later. Next thing I need to do is I need to cut this part off, which will be for clamping the bolt on here. So I've already marked that on here, and I'm going to cut that on the bandsaw. So I just cleaned out that slot with a chisel, and now if I put that on here, put the mounting bolt through here, and now I have a washer on here, and that's what clamps it on here. And now that bolt inserts here fairly easily, but when I tighten up on this knob, it's locked in tight, and that's for holding the gear. I still need to make a top for this block, so that's next.